Hey, church family. Hope all of you are doing well. This is our Wednesday night lesson through the Psalms during quarantine. And so last week we started on Psalm 105, and today we are going to continue going through Psalm 105, and then next week we will also be in Psalm 105. But Psalm 105 kind of takes a look at the history of Israel, starting with Abraham and then going into them coming into the promised land, and goes through and talks about how God was always there with them, that God took care of them. And so we can kind of take that and know that God still takes care of us today. And so we're going to be looking at God's protection and God's providence today. And so in in verse 12 of Psalm 105, when we were only a few in number, very few, and strangers in it, and they wandered about from nation to nation, from one kingdom to another people, he permitted no man to oppress them, and he reproved kings for their sakes. Do not touch my anointed ones, and do my prophets no harm. And so here in verses 12 through 15, we see here God's protection for Israel. And when God called Abraham, it was just Abraham. But then as Abraham went through, there became more and more of them. And then eventually when they went into Egypt, there was 70 family members. There would have been more servants than that. But as Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, as they wandered around in Canaan and through the land, they were small in number compared to their enemies, but God still protected them. And even to this day, even though Israel is small, they are surrounded by many enemies. They have been hated throughout all of history for no reason other than the fact that they are the chosen people. But through all the years, God has protected them. Now, they've had some hiccups where they've had people have attacked them. Most recently, of course, we had the Holocaust, where many millions of Jews were killed for no reason other than the fact that they were Jews. But through it all, that God has still protected them. And so even up to when we look at the history of Israel, modern Israel, just amazing to see things that happen, how they are attacked, but then miraculously, put that in quotes because we know that it's God that is protecting them, but that God continues to protect the nation of Israel. And a lot of times as people at the outside who don't really know what's going on be like, there's no way that Israel should have won this battle, but God has been with them. And so God has protected Israel throughout its history. And so, but the whole time that they're wandering around, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob were wandering around right up until the fact that they were made slaves. They were enslaved in Egypt after they had been there, after Joseph. Everything happened with Joseph and they came in. Up until that point, no one oppressed them. And all the king's people that they came in contact with were good to them. And that's because God had told them. God had told the kings not to do anything to them. And he also said to leave his prophets, that's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He was to bring no harm to them. And we see through this that how God is in control, how God takes care of Israel. And just like that, God takes care of us. And so there might be times when we feel like God isn't taking care of us, something going on, but we can know that God is still there with us. And an example of that we can see with Joseph. And so in verses 16 through 23, we see God's providence. In verse 16, and he called for a famine upon the land. He broke the whole staff of bread. he sent a man before them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. They afflicted his feet with fetters. He himself was laid in irons, until the time that his word came to pass. The word of the Lord tested him. The king sent and released him, the ruler of the peoples, and set him free. He made him lord of his house and ruler over all his possessions, to imprison his princes at will, that he might teach his elders wisdom. Israel also came into Egypt. Thus Jacob sojourned into the land of Ham. So then here in verses 16 through 23, we see God's providence. We see how God is in control, how God plans things ahead, and then later, even though we might be able to look at it and be like, well, that's terrible, but then we can look back and be like, wow, God's hand was in that. So before we saw how God took care of Israel, and here we see how God sent a famine into the land of Canaan. And so, but before he sent the famine into the land, God allowed for Joseph's brothers to sell him into slavery. And while Joseph was in slavery, he was sold to Potiphar, and while he was there with Potiphar, he was tested, but the whole time he stayed true to God, and eventually the king found out about Joseph and had him brought into him, and he interpreted the dream, and so Pharaoh went and put Joseph in charge over his house, over all his possessions. And so what started with a very unjust imprisonment through no fault of his own, Joseph was enslaved, but through that he stayed true to God. He continued to be faithful to him, and God used Joseph in a great way. Because later, when the famine came, it happened all the way. It was throughout the whole region. And so Jacob sent the 10 oldest brothers down into Egypt to get grain because Joseph had been there, and so God had shown Joseph what was going to happen. And so they were preparing all of Egypt for this great famine that was going to happen. And so since Egypt had extra stuff, Joseph's 10 of Joseph's brothers came down to buy grain from them. And then Joseph, we all know, Joseph went and he sent them back. And then when they came back, he said, don't come back unless you bring your other brother, Benjamin, his full brother, Joseph's full brother. And so then when they came back, they brought Benjamin with them, and then they put the money and a special cup in Benjamin's bag. And so they went back going back to Canaan, and then they realized what had happened. And so then they come back, and so that's when Joseph revealed himself to them, and they thought that Joseph was going to kill them because of what he had done, but then Joseph realized that he was there because God had put him there. And so to not just save his brothers, but to save that whole region from starvation. And so Joseph reveals himself. Then he gets reacquainted with his family. They move, all 70 of them move into the land of Goshen. And so we see in verse 23 says that this was where Noah's son Ham had come. And so we know that Ham's descendants settled kind of in Africa, so starting in Egypt and going on down into Africa, and then they also had settled over in parts of Asia. And so that's where they went, whereas the Israelites had come from Shem, and Shem's descendants, they all settled there, right there in the Middle East. And then Japheth's descendants, they went up into Egypt, they went up into Europe, and then also all the way over into East Asia. And so they know that now. Why they know that now, I don't know. Somebody far smarter than me figured all of that out. But we see through these things here, through these happenings, we see how God continued to take care of Abraham's descendants. And so we'll see even more about that next week as they actually come out of Egypt and go into the promised land. But through this, we can also see how God takes care of us. That even though we might be going through something bad now, we just look at the quarantine as bad. Really, I don't. And everything that we're happening now is bad. But individually, sometimes we go through things that are far worse. And as we depend on that God, as we go through that thing that we're going through, that in the end, we'll be able to look back on that and be able to see where God was at work. And as we're going through those bad things in life, we need to continue to worship God. And as hard as that is, we need to continue to worship Him. And then when we get through, and that will help us get through that bad thing. And He will ease things as we're going through that bad thing. But then when we get on the other side, then we'll be able to look back and we'll be able to see God was at work here, He was at work here, He was at work here, He was at work here. And then we'll be able to testify that when we see someone else that's going through those same bad things, we're like, look, God got me through this. Here's how He got me through. And that you'll be able to, that you going through that hard thing will help others go through that hard thing. And so I hope all of you have a great week, and hope to see all of you on Sunday. And we just love you guys. And if anybody needs anything, please let me know. So we'll see you on Sunday. Bye-bye.